Okay, so I'm going to go through the first question for grade 6 ABRSM Theory, and I'm just going to share my screen to show you what we're actually going to be using here. On the left hand side we've got MuseScore. Now you don't have to have MuseScore for this, you can just use the book if you've purchased the book, but I have written all of the questions in MuseScore so you can actually listen back to what the melody sounds like and what you're composing. So if I just play this for a little sec. Okay, so that's the first melody, and what you have to do is harmonize that melody. So you've got to write underneath that melody chords that are going to go well with that particular melody. There are two ways of doing this. ABRSM allows you to just write the Roman numerals underneath the melody, or you can put in the bass notes and fill in the inner parts. I would recommend just keeping it simple. Just write in the Roman numerals, because if you actually start putting in notes to go with this melody, you have to worry about consecutive fifths and octaves, and we're going to be looking at that in a second, but it's much easier to do it the way that I'm going to show you how to do it. Okay, so I'm just going to keep the handout. This is the very first handout from the Dropbox, which shows you all the different things that you need to know for this first exercise. So it might be worthwhile going through this handout first. Make sure you understand the terminologies, what makes a major chord, what makes a minor chord, what makes a diminished chord, and also knowing where chords like to move to. That's what this little picture here, bigger picture on the left, is just a version of the smaller picture on the right that's in the handout. So really what you're seeing here is where chords like to progress to. You don't have to do it this way. It's not as if a composer sits down with a big picture of this in front of them and everything they write has to follow those arrows. It doesn't really work that way. But if you're unsure of where chord 1 likes to move to, or what chord comes after chord 4, what's a good chord that comes before chord 5, that type of thing, this diagram or this map might help. So that's all that it is. And there's a little bit in the handouts as well about inversions, cadences, and we're going to be looking at parallel fifths and octaves in a minute, as I said earlier. So let's jump straight in. Okay, I'm just going to make this slightly bigger just to make the melody fit the screen. There we go. I'll try and keep him up there as well. Okay, so the very first thing you need to do is you need to look at this melody and work out what key you're in. Now obviously the key signature is going to be the main thing to look out for. So it could be D major or it could be B minor, but because there are no raised sevenths that you would expect in B minor, you would expect to see A sharps in the music, but you don't. And also it begins in D, it ends in D, it's very scalic in the key of D major, so everything is within an octave of D, so all the indicators are that we're in the key of D major. So once you've worked out the key of the melody, what you should do then is write out all the triads that are possible in that key, all the diatonic triads, all the triads that belong to the key of D major. So D, F sharp and A for chord 1, E, G, B for chord 2, and so on and so on and so on. The main difference here between grade 6 and grade 5 is that in grade 5 you didn't have to specify the quality of the chord. At grade 6 and grade 7 and grade 8 you do. So you need to be able to show the examiner that you know that an EGB chord, chord 2 in the key of D major, that's going to be a minor chord. And if you're a little unsure about the quality of chords, again, I would refer you back to this handout and have a look at, say, that first slide in the top left corner there, this one here. What makes up a major triad, a minor triad, and a diminished triad. And once you've kind of memorized them all for, in this case, C major, they're going to be the same in every single major key. So all chords 1, 4, and 5 in all major keys are all major triads. Chords 2, 3, and 6, they're all minor triads in major keys. And chord 7 is the special one. It's a diminished triad, and all chord 7s in major keys are diminished triads. So again, because you have the minor third between B and D and the diminished fifth between B and F. So that's the quality of the chords, and you have to kind of memorize that for grade 6. So you can see here, I've written down all of the chords that we have here in the key of D major. And then the next step is use good chord progressions, see below. Well, this is what I was saying earlier about which chords like to follow or come before other chords. You can see there's almost this path, this trajectory from the left hand side to the right hand side. Everything is on a journey to get to chord 1, the tonic chord. There is a couple of exceptions to that. Obviously, chord 1 itself, with the dotted line coming out of it, can basically move anywhere. It's almost like a queen on a chessboard. It can go really any direction. And also chord 5 can move backwards to chord 6 and even to chord 3 sometimes. That would be chord 5 to chord 6 would be known as an interrupted or a deceptive cadence. If you're in America, it's deceptive cadence. If you're in Britain and Ireland, it's an interrupted cadence. That's because it sort of interrupts the flow of travel. Everything seems to be going from left to right, and this is one of the few occasions where you go from right to left. Okay, there's also a circle of fifths progressions in this little diagram that I've circled here. Chord 6 to chord 2 to chord 5 to chord 1. 6, 2, 5, 1 is a very common chord progression. So it's actually known as a circle of fifths as well, because each of those chords is a fifth apart. Chord 6 to 2 is 5 notes, I suppose, apart. Chord 2 to chord 5 is 5 notes apart, and chord 5 to chord 1 is obviously 5 notes apart. So yep, if you're able to work that into your progressions, that's really good, but not to worry if you don't. If you are going to use chord 7, I put a wee asterisk next to it there. You should only really use diminished chords in first inversion, and you can probably get away with not using them at all most of the time, especially in major keys. You'll also note in the handouts that this is for major keys, because I've worked out that we're in D major for this first exercise. But for minor keys, there is another sort of slide or chord progressions that you would need to memorize, and there's all the chord qualities are different in a minor key, obviously, because it's a minor tonality. So chord 1 is obviously a minor chord this time, so note that it's a smaller case Roman numeral as opposed to major keys where it's a capital Roman numeral. 5 and 7 are actually the same. 2 becomes diminished in minor keys. 4 becomes a minor chord in minor keys. Chord 6, confusingly, becomes a major chord in minor keys. And chord 3 becomes a major chord in minor keys. And it's used much more frequently in minor keys than it is in major keys. So you probably don't need to use chord 3 in the example we're doing. It's so rarely used in Baroque and classical music that we don't really need it in major keys. But if this was a minor melody, or a melody in a minor key, you would probably get away with using chord 3 quite a lot. And then there's a special chord, the subtonic chord it's called, and that is used really only to get to chord 3. It's more like the dominant of this chord. Okay, so that's if you're using minor keys, you can have all of these new chords to play around with. But we're just going to stick to the major one for this example. I'll zoom back out again. Also, there's a little bit of inversions in there that we should look at as well. Basically, the main rule to remember is that root position triads are always good. First inversion triads can be used anywhere, but be wary of using second inversion. Only use second inversions at cadences. So, and I would only ever use it for chord 1. So you shouldn't ever use like chord 2 second inversion or chord 5 second inversion. Not for grade 6 anyway. Just leave those chords alone. The only time you should ever use a second inversion chord is for chord 1 and at a cadence. So just be wary of that. Okay, so those are the 4 main steps. Let's see if we can start off. Zoom in a wee bit more. There we go. Okay, we've got 2 Ds. I've got to look at this list of chords and think, what chords could I use here that have D in it? Well, you can of course use chord 1 because it has a D, chord 4 has a D, and chord 6 has a D. I probably want to begin the first beat of the first full bar on chord 1 because it's the strong beat and it's sort of the real beginning of the piece. Even though there's a little upbeat here, there's an anachrosis here, I still want to begin the first bar with chord 1, I think. So I'm just going to click on this guy, and of course in the book you just write this under the asterisk, but I'm just going to put it where the asterisk is. And I'm going to leave it as chord 1 root position. So I know that in this chord, root position chord, I'm going to have D as my lowest note. Now you don't have to put in the root position or the first inversions or anything like that. You don't have to put in any of the notes. I'm just putting it in to show you what the bass note that you're implying will be. So always keep that in mind when you're putting these chords in. What bass note are you implying that goes with the melody that's been given? So I'm implying D as my lowest note. And I probably would want to think, well, what chord has a D in it that likes to go to chord 1? Well, if I look down here, I know that the other chords are going to be chord 4, which has a D, and chord 6, which has a D. But chord 6 doesn't really... Chord 6 doesn't often go to chord 1. It's kind of a jump to get there, but chord 4 does. Chord 4 likes to go to chord 1. In fact, that's our sort of plagal movement. If we use that at a cadence, it would be a plagal cadence. So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to put in chord 4. And if I use chord 4 in root position as well, the bass note that I'm implying with this chord would be G for chord 4. So G in the bass is moving to D in the bass, and in the melody D is just staying on D. Okay, so what about the next chord? What am I going to use for E? Well, for E I could use chord 2, which is E, G, B. I could use chord 5, which is A, C sharp and the E as well. Or I could use chord 7, which has got C sharp, E and G. Any of those is possible really. Because chord 1, as I said before, can move anywhere. Let's just work through each to see what happens. If I use chord 2, keeping it lowercase because it's a minor chord, chord 2. Yeah, I'll just keep this little summary on the right hand side so you can see the major, minor and diminished triads, the quality of the chords on the right hand side here. So if I use chord 2 is an E, G, B chord. So the bass note of that would be E. Now this is where we've run into a wee bit of trouble. Remember earlier I've said that you're not allowed to use parallel fifths and octaves when you're doing this. So between the given melody and the implied bass line, if the bass in this chord is D and the given melody is D, I'm moving to an E in the bass and an E in the melody. That's parallel octaves. So you have to avoid that. The easiest way to avoid it is just invert. Put one of the chords in inversion. You can of course change the chord if you want to. But I'm just going to put 2 as a 2B. So if you're unsure about inversions, do look at the first handout in the folder. And you'll see here there's a little bit of slides that go into how we use A, B and C to indicate root position, first inversion and second inversion. So anytime you put a B next to a triad or next to a Roman numeral, you're basically saying that chord is in first inversion. So it no longer has the E as the lowest note. Now the G is the lowest note in the bass. So I'm just going to change that now to G. And that's got rid of those parallel octaves that we were looking at earlier. Yeah. So that's one way of getting rid of the parallel octaves. You can, of course, just change the chord, but if you do that, you've got to make sure that it's a chord that chord 1 wants to move to, and also be sure that you've got a chord that comes afterwards that's good as well, that chord 2 wants to move to. So chord 2 can sometimes go to chord 7, but most frequently it goes to chord 5. So if we wanted a chord 5 here in the next chord, can we have a chord 5? Not really, because the melody's got an F sharp in it, and chord 5 is A, C sharp, and E, so we can't use chord 5 there. So maybe chord 2 was not a good choice here. Can we use something else that is an F sharp? We could use maybe chord 1, but again, does chord 2 like going to chord 1? Not really. It kind of has jumped this group here, what we call the dominant group. So chord 2 doesn't really like moving to chord 1 that much. So again, I may not do that. Something else that has an F sharp, chord 3 has an F sharp in the chord. It's a minor chord 3. It's an F sharp minor chord. But again, 2 doesn't like moving to 3, and we shouldn't really be using 3 anyway for Baroque and classical music. And I suppose the last thing we're left with is chord 6 with the F sharp. But again, it does happen, don't get me wrong. Chord 2 does move to chord 6 sometimes. It does happen, but it sort of goes against the best progressions, or I suppose the standard progressions, not the best, the standard ones. So I'm probably not going to use chord 6 there either. So I'm just going to put that back to being as an unknown for now, and I might change this guy. Even though it does work with chord 1 before it, it's going to make life hard to get to the next chord that comes afterwards. So I might actually change that to, let me see, something else that has E in it. Well, just maybe chord 5. It's always nice to have your primary chords at the start like this. You know, when you've got your 4 and your 1 and your 5. Those are your primary chords, 1, 4, and 5. They really help establish a key very quickly. So it's kind of nice having that. And 1 and 5 is very popular. Okay. The only thing now is that I have a D in the bass and a D in the melody, an A in the bass and an E in the melody. So I've got a fifth this time between A and E. So I've got to be careful that I don't go to, let's say, chord 6 here in the next chord, because that would have a B in the bass. And again, what I've ended up there with is this time I've ended up with parallel fifths. A to E is a fifth, and B to F sharp is a fifth. So parallel perfect fifths. You have to avoid fifths and octaves. All these parallel perfect fifths and perfect octaves, you can't have them. There's a whole reason behind that. You don't have to go into it. But yeah, it's one of these things that they want you to avoid, especially in Baroque music and mostly classical music too. So 5 is a tricky one because the 5 would like to move to 6, but it could actually have 5 moving back to 1 because 1 also has the F sharp. So I could change this to chord 1, and if I do, I end up with D in the bass. So that's pretty decent. 4, 1, 5, 1. That's a nice sort of chord progression. Sounds something like this. So 4 to 1. And then up to chord 5. And then back to 1. And I could probably go back to chord 4 again. So all of that's possible. What I could do though is instead of going 4 to 1 on root position, I could, if I wanted to, put this into inversion. And instead of using chord 5, what about using something else with E in it, like chord 7? And remember when I said if you're going to use chord 7, only use chord 7 in first inversion. So as a diminished chord, it needs to be in first inversion. So that means that the bass notes for these are now F sharp, I suppose. And for this guy, it's going to be E. And going back to chord 1, it's going to be D. That's a lovely chord progression, believe it or not. I know it looks quite awkward, but if you're able to spot this, the bass is going to be moving down from F sharp, I suppose here, down to E, down to D, while the melody is moving upwards. Country motion is always really good in harmony. If you're able to get that between two voice parts moving in opposite directions like that, it sounds really good. That's called country motion. This chord progression is probably the only time, in fact, that you'll actually use chord 7, and it's very special. It's called the passing 6-3 progression, which a lot of grade 7 students would come into contact with quite frequently. So there's certain chord progressions I teach grade 7 students that they should memorize, and this is one of them that's very, very popular, known as the passing 6-3. When we get to figured bass, you'll see why it's called the passing 6-3, but we'll deal with that another time. Okay, so that's another possibility. Rather than going 4-1-5-1, I've come up with a far more interesting chord progression, which is a good possibility. Okay, so what you would do then, I suppose, is fill out the rest of this in the same fashion as we just done here. Always thinking about where does the chord that you're thinking of using, where can it go to, where does it like to normally go to, and can the melody in the next chord, the melody note, allow you to use the chord that you want to use. There's a couple of occasions there where we had to sort of change our minds because the next chord wasn't really what we wanted. It couldn't be used with the melody. So yeah, be careful of that. And as you go, I would recommend, just for the sake of these exercises, write in the bass note that you're suggesting, and always check to see, are there any fifths or octaves between your implied bass, the bass that you're implying with the chords that you've chosen, and their position, the inversion that you've chosen, and the given melody line, which you cannot change. You can't move any of those notes. You have to use them. It'd be so much easier if you could move them, but you can't. Also watch out for these sort of extension lines here. Basically what that means is whatever chord you've decided to harmonize with this asterisk, it's going to last until the end of the bar. Same for the next bar, and same for the following bar. That's actually going to last for 2 beats until you get to the final beat of that bar. And for the ending, you've got a cadence that you have to think about. Well, because we're in the key of D major, obviously I'm going to want to use a chord 1 there, oops, at the very end, just to make it nice and sort of final and strong after, 8 bars or something. Now, you can, of course, go over to this handout and see the type of cadences you can use. Perfect, plagal, imperfect, and interrupted, and these are the chords that are used for each of those cadences, the last 2 chords that finish off a phrase. But because the most popular one is the perfect cadence, but we can't really use it here because chord 5 is not going to go into this chord. Chord 5 is A, C sharp, and E, and the note that we're trying to harmonize is D, so we can't use chord 5. But chord 4 we could use, and that gives us a nice plagal cadence at the end, 4-1. And again, that's very similar to the opening, 4-1, so there's a wee bit of unity there's a sort of a repeated idea. It's kind of nice. So also pay attention then to the last 2 chords, because you have to come up with a standard cadence. You can't just end on like a chord 2 or a chord 3 or something. It's got to be one of these 4 standard cadences. Most of these exercises, in fact, will allow you to end on a perfect cadence, but it's pretty unusual. The very first one in the book forces you to use a plagal cadence instead of a perfect. But see how you get on. Finish off the rest of it. And if you need any help, of course, let me know. But do read through the handout, I would say, first, to make sure you understand the theoretical concepts first before having a go at the practice of the exercises here. But hopefully that will give you some idea of how to do the first question, and let me know how you get on.